Welcome to Swift Tale. If you're new here, make sure to hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe so you don't miss out on stories like this one. Today, we're diving into a shocking story that highlights the abuse of power and the painful reality of racial injustice. Imagine being humiliated, not by a stranger, but by the very people who are supposed to protect and serve you. That's exactly what happened to a black woman when a group of police officers thought it would be fun to shave her hair. What they didn't expect, though, was the ultimate twist. She wasn't just any woman, she was a judge, and she was about to walk into that courtroom as the one in charge. This is a story that's not only about personal humiliation, but also about empowerment, resilience, and justice. It's about how this woman took the ultimate moment of disrespect and turned it into a statement of power. This incident matters because it's part of a much larger conversation about racial discrimination, police misconduct, and the need for accountability. So stick around as we break down what happened, the consequences of this shocking act, and why it's a story we all need to pay attention to. To truly understand the gravity of what happened, we need to start from the beginning. The incident took place in a small, yet highly significant, moment of abuse that shook the community and drew national attention. It all started when a black woman, who had been detained by local law enforcement, found herself the victim of an appalling and degrading act. While in police custody, the officers decided, without any legal or ethical justification, to shave her hair. What they saw as an innocent act of fun quickly spiraled into a deeply hurtful moment of humiliation that would haunt her, not just personally, but professionally. The officers, who were supposed to serve and protect, saw her as nothing more than an object of ridicule. They took advantage of their authority, crossing a line that no one should ever cross. The act itself was more than just a physical violation. It was a symbolic attack on her dignity and identity. For many people, particularly women of color, hair is deeply tied to culture, pride, and self-expression. Shaving someone's hair without consent is a powerful act of control, one that strips away more than just strands of hair. It strips away a sense of personal power. But why did the officers think this was acceptable? Well, some of it can be traced to deep-rooted biases and assumptions about race and gender. For them, it seemed like a harmless prank, but for the woman involved, it was a form of emotional and psychological assault. Worse still, the officers involved didn't seem to think they'd face any real consequences. This was just another instance of a system that has historically allowed those in power to get away with blatant misconduct. As the story unfolds, you'll see just how far-reaching the consequences would be, not only for the woman, but also for the officers who thought they could escape the repercussions of their actions. The community's response was immediate and strong. Many were outraged, calling the incident an example of the everyday abuse that black people, particularly black women, face in the criminal justice system. Local civil rights organizations quickly began mobilizing to ensure that the officers were held accountable. Meanwhile, the woman who had been humiliated remained calm, composed, and resolute, never losing sight of the bigger picture. She had been wronged, and she would not let this act of cruelty define her. But what she did next would stun everyone and shift the entire narrative. To truly understand the significance of this story, it's essential to know more about the woman at the center of it all, the victim of this shocking and deeply personal attack. She wasn't just any individual caught in a random encounter with the law. She was a professional, an accomplished woman who had spent years working hard to get to where she was. At the time of the incident, she was a respected member of her community, with a career that reflected her dedication to justice and fairness. But beyond her professional accomplishments, her story is one of resilience, strength, and an unshakable belief in justice, even in the face of adversity. The woman, who we refer to as Judge Name, had worked her way up the ranks to become a judge in her local jurisdiction. This was not an easy feat. Her rise to the bench had been marked by years of hard work, overcoming obstacles, and proving herself in an often hostile environment. As a black woman, her journey was even more difficult, as systemic racism and biases in the legal field often made it harder for people like her to succeed. Yet she persevered, carving out a path for herself in a field that has historically been dominated by white men. Judge Name was known for her sharp intellect, her unwavering commitment to justice, and her empathy toward those who came before her in court. She had earned the respect of her colleagues, the public, and the legal community at large. This wasn't someone who could be easily ignored or pushed aside. Her position as a judge not only gave her a platform for justice, but also positioned her as a role model for other women, particularly women of color, who aspired to achieve similar success in a world that often made their dreams feel unattainable. But when the officers decided to humiliate her by shaving her hair, they didn't just target her as an individual, they targeted her identity. They didn't know who they were dealing with. In the eyes of these officers, they saw a woman to be mocked, not a judge to be respected. They saw someone whose power they thought they could diminish, but they had underestimated the strength and resilience that Judge Name possessed. The incident took a toll on her, no doubt. Being subjected to such a violation was not something anyone should have to endure, let alone someone who had dedicated their life to upholding the law. Yet, what made her unique wasn't just the fact that she had been a victim of this terrible act, it was the way she handled it. Despite the public shamming and the emotional scars, Judge Name did not crumble. Instead, she found her voice in the midst of chaos, and as you'll see, she would turn the tables in a way no one expected. To understand the full extent of the humiliation and the abuse of power that took place, we need to dig deeper into the motivations behind the actions of the officers involved. What could have possibly prompted them to target this woman in such a personal and degrading way? Was it just a moment of misguided fun, or was there something more insidious at play? On the surface, the officers might have seen their actions as a harmless prank, a way to let off steam in an otherwise mundane day of law enforcement. They may have thought that because the woman was in their custody, they had the right to treat her however they pleased. For them, it wasn't about who she was or what she had achieved. It was about exercising their power over someone they saw as lesser in that moment. But what's important to recognize is that this wasn't a random act of fun. The act of shaving her hair was not just a physical violation, it was a symbolic attack on her identity. For many black women, hair is not just a physical trait, but a deeply ingrained part of their cultural heritage and self-expression. By shaving her hair, the officers were attempting to strip away a part of her that carried personal, emotional, and cultural significance. They saw her as vulnerable, as someone they could control or diminish simply because of her position at that moment. They didn't see her as a judge, a person who had earned the right to be respected. They saw her as a target for ridicule. This kind of behavior is rooted in deep racial biases. For these officers, it may have been part of a larger pattern of seeing black people as objects of scorn rather than as individuals deserving of respect and dignity. Their decision to target her specifically can be seen as part of a broader issue in law enforcement, where racial stereotypes and prejudices often shape how officers interact with people of color. In their eyes, she wasn't a judge or a professional. They saw her as other, someone they could disrespect and dehumanize without consequence. It's also possible that the officers' motivations were tied to an inflated sense of power. As law enforcement officers, they are given authority over people in their custody, and many abuse that power when they feel untouchable. The woman, who had been detained, was at their mercy. The act of shaving her hair was a way for them to assert control in a vulnerable situation, showing her, and anyone else who witnessed the incident, just how much power they held over her. In the broader context of police misconduct, this situation wasn't an isolated event, but part of a larger systemic issue. Police officers have historically been granted a level of impunity when it comes to their interactions with marginalized communities, especially black people. What we see here is not just individual misconduct. It's a reflection of the culture within certain parts of law enforcement, where people in positions of power feel they can act with impunity. But what these officers failed to realize was that their fun would come at a much greater cost than they ever anticipated. As we'll see, the woman they targeted would prove to be far more than they bargained for, and her response would force the system to reckon with their behavior in ways they never imagined. The aftermath of this shocking incident was swift and intense, triggering both legal and public responses that could not be ignored. Once the details of the police officers' actions became public, the community was outraged, and calls for accountability began to flood in. What had initially been a seemingly isolated act of humiliation quickly became a flashpoint for a much larger conversation about police misconduct, racial injustice, and the need for reform within law enforcement. On the legal front, the woman who had been humiliated by the officers took immediate steps to ensure that the incident didn't go unnoticed or unchallenged. With the help of her legal team, she filed a formal complaint against the officers, demanding an investigation into their behavior. The question that loomed over the legal proceedings was simple. How could a group of law enforcement officers believe that they were above the law, especially when their actions so blatantly violated the victim's rights and dignity? At first, it seemed as though the police department might try to downplay the incident. After all, cases involving law enforcement misconduct often go underreported or are swept under the rug, especially if the officers involved belong to a powerful institution. However, this case was different. The public outcry was loud and unified. It wasn't just the victim who was seeking justice, it was the entire community, along with many civil rights organizations who were demanding answers. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a part of a larger pattern of police abuse, and people were no longer willing to stand by and watch it go unchecked. The story spread quickly on social media, sparking debates across the country about police violence, the dehumanization of Black people, and the systemic racism embedded in law enforcement. Hashtags like Justice for Victims Name and End Police Brutality began trending, and activists from various movements, such as Black Lives Matter, rallied behind the victim. For many, this incident became a symbol of the everyday mistreatment that Black women, and Black people in general, face when interacting with the justice system. But the response wasn't just limited to the streets or social media. Various legal organizations, both local and national, began to investigate the matter more thoroughly. The Department of Justice, DOJ, launched an inquiry into the police department's practices, questioning how such a gross violation of human rights could happen in the first place. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave pending the results of the investigation, which sent a strong message that there would be no tolerance for this kind of behavior. While many were hopeful that the legal system would work in favor of justice, others were more skeptical. Unfortunately, cases involving police misconduct often lead to little more than internal investigations that result in minimal disciplinary action or even no action at all. This time, however, the victim's position as a judge added a powerful layer to the case that was hard for the system to ignore. Her credibility, her profession, and her standing in the community all contributed to the growing pressure on law enforcement to take this case seriously. The public response was equally as powerful. People rallied behind the victim, applauding her bravery in coming forward and demanding that the officers be held accountable for their actions. Local leaders, activists, and even members of the legal community began speaking out, emphasizing that this wasn't just an isolated incident, but part of a broader problem of police abuse. For the victim, the legal and public response provided a sense of validation. The support she received from the community, activists, and the general public helped her feel less isolated in the aftermath of such a traumatic experience. The incident had shaken her, but it also sparked a movement that questioned the very foundations of law enforcement and demanded change. The case also underscored the need for greater transparency and accountability within police departments. The question on everyone's mind was how such an abuse of power could go unnoticed by supervisors or higher-ranking officials. Had this been an isolated incident, or was it part of a larger pattern of behavior within the department? As the investigation continued, the answers to these questions would begin to unfold, revealing just how deep the problem ran within law enforcement. Ultimately, the incident became a pivotal moment in the ongoing national conversation about police brutality, racism, and the lack of accountability within law enforcement. It wasn't just about one woman and one incident. It was about the systemic issues that had allowed this kind of abuse to occur unchecked. And as the case moved forward, it became clear that the woman at the center of it all wasn't just seeking justice for herself. she was fighting for something much larger. Just when it seemed like the story couldn't take another unexpected turn, it did, this time, in a way that no one could have anticipated. The woman who had been the target of such a cruel and humiliating act wasn't just a victim in this story. She wasn't some passive bystander waiting for justice to come to her. She was a judge, and she was about to step into the very courtroom where justice was supposed to be served, not as a witness, but as the one in charge. When news broke that the woman at the center of this incident was, in fact, a judge, the public's reaction was nothing short of shock and awe. It was a plot twist that no one had seen coming. How could this woman, who had been disrespected and dehumanized by those who were supposed to protect her, turn the tables in such a powerful way? The answer was simple. She had strength, resilience, and an unwavering belief in her ability to seek justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. As she entered the courtroom that day, it was clear that this wasn't going to be business as usual. The officers who had previously mocked her, shaving her hair for fun, found themselves on the other side of the legal system, standing before her as defendants. The irony was palpable. These were the same officers who thought they could degrade her in the most personal way possible, only to now face her as the authority figure in the very place where justice was meant to be served. The moment was a powerful one. Imagine the stunned silence that must have fallen over the courtroom when the officers recognized who was presiding over the case. For them, it must have been a moment of complete realization. Their actions had not only failed to break her, but had led them directly into her domain. The woman they had sought to diminish had now become their judge, holding the power they had so carelessly abused. It was a reversal of roles that underscored the true nature of justice. It wasn't about power over others, but about fairness, dignity, and respect for all individuals, regardless of who they were or where they came from. This moment was more than just a personal triumph for the woman. It was symbolic of something much bigger, a moment where the victim reclaimed her power, her identity, and her authority. In a world where people in positions of power often escape consequences for their actions, the woman's presence in that courtroom represented a form of justice that many believed was out of reach. She wasn't there to seek vengeance. She was there to ensure that accountability was served and that those who had wronged her would face the consequences of their actions. The officers who had once laughed at her expense were now the ones who had to answer for their misconduct. And in that moment, the roles of victim and perpetrator were irrevocably reversed. The woman wasn't just seeking personal retribution. She was standing as a beacon for all those who had been similarly mistreated, for all those who had ever been powerless in the face of institutional abuse. Her courage in walking into that courtroom as the judge, rather than the victim, sent a powerful message. No one, not even those in positions of power, could escape the law. For the officers involved, the reality of the situation quickly set in. No longer were they the ones with control. Now they were the ones being judged, the ones facing the consequences of their actions. They may have thought their actions were harmless or that they would be protected by the badge they wore, but in the face of the law, they were just like any other defendant, subject to the same standards of justice as anyone else. This shift in power was as much psychological as it was legal. For the woman, stepping into that courtroom was about more than just fulfilling her duty as a judge. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her voice, and her place in the world. It was a symbolic moment of triumph over adversity, a message to the world that no matter how badly one is treated, there is always a chance for redemption, for justice, and for change. The public response to this turn of events was immediate and overwhelming. News outlets across the country covered the story, highlighting the irony and significance of the moment. People took to social media to share their awe and admiration for the woman's courage. Memes and hashtags went viral, with people expressing their shock at the turn of events and celebrating her resilience. The moment captured the imagination of a nation, not just for the sheer drama of it, but for the larger message it sent. Justice could be wielded by anyone, regardless of their past experiences or how society viewed them. For the officers, however, the moment must have felt like a wake-up call. The woman they had mocked and humiliated was now their superior in the very system they thought they could manipulate. It was a sobering reminder that the law doesn't play favorites. It holds everyone accountable, regardless of their position or privilege. As the courtroom drama unfolded, the officers were forced to face not just the legal consequences of their actions, but the emotional and psychological weight of their behavior. They had humiliated a woman who had done nothing to deserve such treatment, and now they were facing the person they had tried to break. It was a powerful moment of justice in a world where too often the scales tip in favor of those with power. But in this case, the scales were balanced. And the woman who had been the target of humiliation stood as a reminder to us all that no one is above the law. As the courtroom drama unfolded, it became clear that the case wasn't just about one woman seeking justice. It was about exposing a larger truth about power, accountability, and the systems that often protect those who abuse their positions. The woman who had been humiliated by the officers was now in the role of the judge, and the officers who had once laughed at her expense were now the ones facing her judgment. What followed was not just a legal proceeding, it was a powerful, symbolic moment that captured the attention of everyone in the courtroom and the public at large. The tension was palpable as the officers, once so confident in their actions, now found themselves standing in the defendant's box. Their expressions were a mix of discomfort and disbelief. The very individuals who had seen her as a target for ridicule were now under scrutiny, held accountable for their actions in a way they had never expected. As they looked up at her from the defendant's table, they had to come to terms with one undeniable fact. They were now facing the consequences of their abuse of power, and the woman they had once tried to degrade was the one holding them accountable. The atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with emotion. Those present, lawyers, witnesses, and even spectators, could sense the gravity of the moment. The woman, as the presiding judge, maintained an air of professionalism and composure, but there was a quiet strength in her presence. Her every word carried weight, and her decision to continue the proceedings without any hint of malice or vengeance spoke volumes. She wasn't seeking to settle a personal score. She was upholding the law and ensuring that those who had violated it would be held responsible. The officers' defense was predictable. They attempted to downplay the incident, calling it a misunderstanding or a moment of poor judgment. They argued that the shaving of her hair wasn't meant to be malicious, that it was just a misguided attempt at humor. But the judge, understanding the gravity of their actions, wasn't having it. She rejected their justifications outright, explaining that the act wasn't just about the physical act of shaving someone's hair. It was about control, humiliation, and the abuse of power that occurs when those in positions of authority think they can act without consequence. She reminded everyone in the courtroom that what had happened wasn't a simple prank. It was a violation of a human being's dignity, and no amount of minimizing could change that. The victim, though no longer the center of attention in this phase of the proceedings, had a quiet but powerful presence. She sat in the courtroom as the judge, poised and dignified, fully aware of the significance of her role. She wasn't merely presiding over the case. She was a living testament to the power of resilience and the importance of standing up against injustice, even in the face of overwhelming odds. While the officers were trying to paint themselves as misunderstood figures, the judge's actions spoke louder than any words. Her unwavering commitment to fairness and justice became the focal point of the proceedings. As the defense team for the officers attempted to introduce mitigating factors, such as their previous good standing in the police force, their spotless records, or their intentions, the judge made it clear that none of that mattered. In the eyes of the law, their actions were indefensible. She called out their attempts to reduce their actions to mere mistakes, stressing that the emotional and psychological harm they had caused went far beyond what could be written off as bad judgment. She emphasized that no one, especially law enforcement officers who are entrusted with public trust, should ever be allowed to use their authority to strip away another person's humanity. The courtroom was not just witnessing a legal case, it was witnessing a moment of profound change. The officers, who had assumed they would be protected by the shield of law enforcement, were now facing a reckoning. They were learning a harsh lesson in accountability, something that far too often eludes those in positions of power. Their actions had been seen for what they were, an attempt to degrade, humiliate, and dominate a person who was already vulnerable. As the proceedings continued, the weight of the case seemed to bear down on the officers. The more they tried to downplay their actions, the more the judge's piercing words held them accountable. Her questions were direct, her observations sharp, and the message was clear. This was not just about a single incident, it was about a pattern of behavior that could not and would not be ignored. Throughout the trial, the public's reaction was closely monitored. People on social media, legal commentators, and activists all weighed in on the proceedings. Many expressed their admiration for the judge, praising her for handling the case with such grace and integrity while maintaining a firm stance on justice. Her ability to balance professionalism with a deep sense of empathy was noted by observers, who saw her not just as a legal authority, but as a symbol of hope for those who had experienced similar mistreatment. Trial became a flashpoint for discussions about systemic issues within law enforcement. While the legal case at hand was specific to the officers involved in this incident, it became a larger conversation about police reform, racial justice, and the importance of holding those in positions of power accountable for their actions. The officers' attempt to dismiss their actions as harmless only further illustrated the disconnect between how the law sees justice and how those in power often view their own behavior. The case, more than any courtroom drama, shed light on the urgent need for change. As the session drew to a close, the judge made it clear that there would be consequences. The officers were not going to walk away from this without facing accountability. The legal process, while still ongoing, was beginning to look much less like a typical case and much more like a turning point in the way justice was being applied to those who had long been shielded from it. In that moment, it was clear. Justice wasn't just about ruling in favor of the victim. It was about sending a message that no one, regardless of their position, would be allowed to undermine the dignity of another person without facing the consequences. When the news broke that the woman who had been humiliated by the officers was, in fact, the judge presiding over the case, the public's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. People across the country, many of whom had been following the story from the beginning, were stunned by the dramatic turn of events. It wasn't just the twist of the victim becoming the judge that caught people's attention. It was the larger implications of the moment. How an act of cruelty and humiliation was being met with a powerful assertion of justice. Social media erupted with reactions. Tweets, Facebook posts, and Instagram stories flooded platforms with expressions of disbelief, awe, and support for the woman. Hashtags like #JudgeNotVictim and #PowerInResilience quickly gained traction, with users across the globe sharing the story, reflecting on its deeper meaning, and celebrating the woman's strength. The viral spread of the story sparked conversations not only about the specifics of the case, but also about broader societal issues of race, power, and the systemic abuse within law enforcement. For many, this was more than just a story of personal revenge or redemption. It was a reminder of the enduring power of dignity in the face of injustice. The woman, who had been the victim of such a personal and humiliating violation, had turned the tables and reclaimed her sense of agency in a way that sent a resounding message. She wasn't just a judge in that courtroom. She was a symbol of resilience and an embodiment of the idea that no one, not even those who wear badges of power, should be above the law. Her composure, intelligence, and determination to uphold justice in that moment inspired countless people who saw her not just as a legal authority, but as a role model for anyone who has ever faced degradation or injustice. Activists, particularly those in movements like Black Lives Matter, seized on this moment as a turning point in their broader fight for justice and accountability. For them, the image of a black woman who had been humiliated and stripped of her dignity by the very people who were supposed to protect her, now standing as the judge in the case, was deeply symbolic. It wasn't just a victory for the individual woman in question. It was a victory for all those who had been similarly victimized by a system that too often fails to hold law enforcement accountable for their actions. But the public reaction wasn't universally positive. Of course, there were some who sought to minimize the significance of the moment. Critics of the judge, as well as some law enforcement sympathizers, argued that the situation had been blown out of proportion. They claimed that the officers didn't mean any harm and that the whole incident was being sensationalized for political gain. These voices tried to paint the judge's actions as merely an emotional response to a minor offense. However, these arguments were quickly drowned out by the overwhelming tide of public support for the judge and her pursuit of justice. At its core, the case was a reminder that true accountability in law enforcement requires more than just the occasional legal consequence. It requires an institutional commitment to transparency, equity, and reform. The story of the victim and the legal consequences for the officers involved acted as a wake-up call, a reminder that law enforcement agencies must hold their officers accountable not just when they are caught, but at every level of their operations. Only through such systemic changes can we ensure that justice is truly served, both in the courtroom and in the streets. One of the most powerful aspects of this case was the unwavering support from the community and the activists who rallied behind the victim from the very beginning. While the legal proceedings and media coverage garnered much attention, it was the grassroots activism and the collective power of community support that helped propel the case to the national stage. From protests to online petitions, from community leaders to everyday citizens, the outpouring of solidarity sent a clear message. This was not just one woman's fight, but a collective struggle for justice and equality. As soon as news of the incident broke, local activists were among the first to organize around the case. They understood that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of police misconduct, racial violence, and the systemic dehumanization of marginalized communities. They quickly began mobilizing rallies, town hall meetings, and online campaigns to raise awareness and demand action. Their message was clear. What had happened to the victim was not just a violation of her rights, it was a violation of the community's trust in law enforcement. Social media played a central role in amplifying the voices of activists and organizing support for the victim. Hashtags like Justice for Victims Name and End Police Abuse began trending within hours of the incident being reported, and the calls for justice were echoed across platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. These online campaigns were not only aimed at raising awareness, but also at holding the police accountable. Activists used these platforms to share updates, organize protests, and pressure local authorities to take action. The viral nature of the story made it impossible for the case to be ignored, forcing both the police department and local government to respond to the growing demands for accountability. The role of activism was especially crucial in highlighting the systemic nature of the abuse. While many people focused on the immediate act of shaving the woman's hair, activists were quick to connect it to a larger issue of racial injustice, police violence, and the abuse of power. They used the case to draw attention to the fact that incidents like this weren't isolated events. They were symptoms of a deeply flawed system that often protected officers who engaged in misconduct. In this way, the case became a rallying cry for larger reforms, with activists calling for changes to police training, accountability mechanisms, and the need to address institutional racism within law enforcement. One of the most powerful demonstrations of community support came from local organizations and civil rights groups that stood behind the victim, providing not just moral support, but tangible resources. These groups helped to raise funds for legal fees, mobilized activists to attend court hearings, and ensured that the victim's voice was heard at every stage of the legal process. Their involvement was a reminder that activism is not just about protest, it's about providing the resources and infrastructure needed to fight for justice, even in the most difficult circumstances. In addition to local activists, national civil rights organizations like the ACLU, Black Lives Matter, and others began to lend their support to the case. Their involvement brought the case to an even broader audience and gave it the weight of national attention. Their advocacy extended beyond the courtroom, helping to shape the broader conversation about police brutality and the need for systemic change. They organized rallies, hosted forums, and worked with legal experts to ensure that the case would have the maximum impact on the national conversation around policing and racial justice. But it wasn't just high-profile activists who made a difference. Everyday citizens, many of whom had never been involved in activism before, took to the streets and social media to show their support for the victim. These were the people who signed petitions, showed up to protests, and engaged in conversations about police reform in their communities. They shared their own stories of encountering racism and discrimination, which helped to humanize the victim and build solidarity across different communities. The support for the victim wasn't just about one woman's suffering, it was about the collective pain of all those who had been marginalized and oppressed by a system that often prioritized the protection of law enforcement over the rights of citizens. The victim herself became a symbol of resilience for many. She wasn't just the woman whose hair had been shaved. It was her courage in speaking out, in pursuing justice, and in standing firm in the face of overwhelming adversity that inspired so many. She became a beacon of hope for others who had suffered in silence, and her story demonstrated the power of one individual to spark a larger movement for change. Activists and community members alike rallied behind her, echoing her message that the fight for justice and dignity was far from over. One of the most powerful elements of the activism surrounding this case was its intersectionality. The case not only highlighted issues of police violence and misconduct, but also touched on the ways in which race, gender, and power intersected. Many activists focused on the fact that the victim was a black woman, a demographic that is often overlooked in discussions of police brutality. The abuse she endured was not just racial, it was gendered. Black women, as the case demonstrated, are disproportionately affected by both racial and gendered violence, yet their experiences are often erased or downplayed in mainstream narratives. By highlighting the victim's identity and the specific challenges she faced as a black woman, the case brought attention to the need for greater inclusion in discussions of police violence and reform. The strength of community support didn't just come from protesters, it also came from the victim's community, her family, and her loved ones. They provided her with a sense of belonging and strength during the most difficult moments of the trial. Their unwavering support reminded her that she wasn't fighting alone. In the face of systemic oppression, it is often the community that provides the emotional and practical resources necessary to push for change. And in this case, the community didn't just support her, they helped her win a battle against the forces that sought to dehumanize her. In the aftermath of the case, the continued engagement of the community and activists remained vital. While the legal outcome was an important victory, the fight for systemic change in law enforcement didn't end with the verdict. Activists and community groups continued to push for reforms and hold law enforcement accountable for the way they interact with marginalized communities. The case became a key example of how grassroots activism, when supported by a broad coalition of allies, can change the course of justice and demand accountability from those in power. The collective effort to support the victim, both during the trial and after the verdict, was a reminder of the power of community action. The case wasn't just about one woman's triumph, it was a triumph for all those who had been silenced, ignored, and mistreated by a system that failed to protect them. Through the unwavering support of activists, civil rights organizations, and everyday citizens, the victim was able to turn her personal tragedy into a symbol of resistance, resilience, and hope for a more just future. The story of this case is not just a legal or political one. It is, at its heart, a deeply personal journey for the victim. What began as a cruel and humiliating act at the hands of law enforcement officers became the catalyst for her transformation, from a woman who suffered an unimaginable violation to a courageous figure at the forefront of a larger fight for justice. Her path through this ordeal wasn't just about seeking justice for what had happened to her. It was about reclaiming her voice, her dignity, and her humanity in a world that often dehumanizes those who are most vulnerable. When the incident first occurred, the victim found herself thrust into a nightmare. She had been humiliated in one of the most intimate ways possible. Her hair, a symbol of her identity and pride, had been shaved without her consent. Beyond the physical act itself, the emotional toll was immeasurable. It was an experience that shattered her sense of security, not just in the officers involved, but in the very institution that was supposed to protect her rights. Her world had been upended, and she was forced to grapple with feelings of anger, helplessness, and a sense of betrayal. At first, the victim didn't know what to do. She felt isolated and unsure of how to navigate the complexity of a system that had, for so long, protected those who had wronged her. She wondered if anyone would believe her, if anyone would stand by her. The victim's emotions were raw, and the thought of confronting the officers who had hurt her seemed almost impossible. But as time passed, something inside her shifted. What began as a desire for revenge turned into something more powerful, a deep resolve to seek justice, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been subjected to abuse by those in power. The decision to take action was not an easy one. It meant enduring public scrutiny, facing the officers who had wronged her, and navigating a legal system that often sides with law enforcement in cases of misconduct. The victim knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she also understood that the only way to make sure this never happened to anyone else was to speak up. Her decision was not just a personal choice. It was an act of defiance against a system that had long failed to hold law enforcement officers accountable for their actions. Throughout the legal process, the victim displayed an incredible amount of resilience. She faced public scrutiny, invasive media coverage, and the emotional weight of reliving the trauma every time she spoke about the incident. But she never backed down. With each step, she became more determined, more focused on the larger picture. She began to see her role not just as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. Her willingness to stand up and demand justice resonated with many, inspiring others who had suffered in silence to come forward and tell their own stories. She became the face of a larger movement, a movement for justice, equality, and police accountability. One of the most difficult parts of her journey was navigating the emotional toll of the case. While she was deeply committed to her cause, she was also forced to confront the scars left by the incident. The emotional trauma of being dehumanized and humiliated took its toll on her mental health. But as the case progressed, she began to find strength in the support she received from her community, her family, and the countless strangers who had rallied behind her. The solidarity she felt from others gave her the courage to keep moving forward, even when the weight of the situation felt overwhelming. Over time, the victim realized that her personal journey was not just about seeking justice for the wrong done to her, it was about healing. The legal process allowed her to begin the work of reclaiming her sense of self-worth and dignity. It was through the act of speaking out, of challenging the system that had wronged her, that she started to rebuild herself. She began to see her voice not as a symbol of victimhood, but as a symbol of empowerment. Her actions sent a powerful message to those who had once sought to silence her. No one could take away her dignity, and no one could strip her of her humanity. Her transformation from a victim of police misconduct to a vocal advocate for justice was not just a personal evolution, it was also a statement about the power of resilience. The victim's journey was a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the way in which personal adversity can be turned into a force for larger social change. Her decision to pursue legal action, to face the officers who had wronged her, and to speak out about her experience was an act of personal empowerment. Through this journey, she showed the world that it is possible to reclaim one's power, even after the most painful of experiences. The victim's journey also served as a reminder that healing is not linear. It wasn't as simple as winning a legal case or receiving an apology. The emotional scars left by the incident would never fully disappear, but through the process of seeking justice and standing up for what was right, she was able to regain a sense of agency and control over her life. It was a long and difficult road, but it was a road she chose to walk with her head held high, knowing that she was doing it for a cause much larger than herself. By the time the legal proceedings concluded, the victim had become more than just a symbol of resistance. She had become a leader, a voice for those who had long been silenced by injustice. She had shown that speaking out against abuse of power, even when it seems insurmountable, can bring about change. Her journey was not just about the outcome of her case, but about the personal growth and healing that came from facing down the trauma and using her experience to ignite a broader conversation about police accountability and systemic reform. In the end, the victim's journey wasn't just about what happened to her, it was about what she chose to do with that experience. Her decision to seek justice, to speak out, and to use her platform for change was an act of immense courage. It was a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the power of personal resilience. Her story is one of triumph, not just over the officers who sought to humiliate her, but over the systems of oppression that have long attempted to silence the voices of those most in need of justice. As we reflect on the case of the victim, whose hair was shaved by officers for their amusement, it's clear that this wasn't just about a single act of police misconduct. It's about much more, a profound examination of the systems of power, racial injustice, and the ways in which marginalized people, especially Black women, have historically been dehumanized and silenced. This case shines a spotlight on the necessity of police accountability, the critical role of community support, and the power of activism to fuel social change. It also reminds us of the enduring importance of seeking justice, no matter how difficult the journey may be. What started as a cruel and degrading act became, in the end, a triumph of justice. The victim's decision to stand up for herself, despite the overwhelming odds and the emotional toll, sparked a national conversation about police abuse, racial discrimination, and the treatment of Black women. Her courage in the face of immense adversity not only led to legal consequences for the officers involved, but also created a ripple effect that fueled a broader movement for change. The case demonstrated that even when the system seems stacked against you, justice can still prevail when individuals and communities come together and demand it. But the work does not end with this case. While this specific chapter may have closed, the fight for police reform, racial justice, and the protection of marginalized communities continues. This case, like so many others, is just one small piece of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that we can only solve if we remain vigilant, engaged, and unrelenting in our pursuit of equality. The victim's story is a reminder that when we stand together, when we raise our voices and demand accountability, we can create a world where justice is not just a legal concept, but a lived reality for everyone. We can never forget the significance of this case, not only because of the outcome, but because it brought to light so many of the issues that continue to plague our society. The victim's bravery has set a powerful example for others who have been silenced by injustice, proving that one person can make a difference. Her story is not just a tale of legal victory. It is a story of empowerment, of reclaiming one's dignity, and of showing the world that when we fight for what is right, we do so not just for ourselves, but for the future generations who will inherit the society we leave behind. As we look toward the future, we must remember that the fight for justice is far from over. There are still many people who suffer in silence, many cases that go unnoticed, and many wrongs that remain unaddressed. But with the lessons of this case as our guide, we can continue to push for systemic change. We can continue to demand better from our institutions, from our leaders, and from ourselves. This case is a stark reminder that we must not rest until real reform takes place, and until every individual, regardless of their race, gender, or background, is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. In closing, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this video and to reflect on the deeper issues surrounding police brutality, systemic racism, and the pursuit of justice. This case is a powerful reminder that when we come together and demand change, we can achieve it. The journey is long, but each step we take toward justice is one step closer to a world where everyone can live without fear of abuse, discrimination, or violence. If this story resonated with you, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends and family, and subscribe to Swift Tale for more content on important social issues. I also encourage you to leave a comment below. Let me know your thoughts on this case and what you think needs to change in our justice system to prevent these types of abuses from happening in the future. Remember, we all have a role to play in making our world a better place. Keep fighting for justice, keep raising your voice, and keep pushing for change. Together, we can make a difference.